So hello everybody, and hello especially to my guest this evening. I have the scholar, the writer, the collage artist, Javier Gomez Rodriguez with me this evening. Hello.
Hello, hello, Sandy.
Oh, could you tell everybody where you're joining us from?
This is from Spain, northwest of Spain, Galicia. It's my native little corner here on the Celtic Fringe. We're just on the Atlantic coast, near Santiago, about 60 kilometers southwest of Santiago de Compostela.
And this is the area you grew up in.
Yes, that's where I was born and grew up. This is,
I know this is a really big question to ask straight off the bat, but do you have a sense of belonging to this place?
I do, in a sense, because I guess one's early experiences tend to be very much connected to place and time, even to geography.
Mm.
And this is a very rural area. And I grew up in a subsistence farming community. So we were part of the land, and the land was part of us. And we're between the mountains, the hills, and the sea. So there is a combination of all the elements. And I always felt like this was my little metaphysical kingdom. So I, I do have a very close connection. I know almost every rock on the hills, you see. But again, I'm not particularly attached because I lived most of my life abroad. I left when I was 17 and I never really resettled here.
I ask because I mean it is a very uh, rich area in terms of culture and
Mm,
history, and also what it will mean to many people who maybe watch or listen. Um,
mm.
kind of steeped in a, would you say, a complicated history, or is it a
Sure,
history?
sure, sure. Spain has had a complicated history, and Galicia has been part of that very much. Even though it's a bit of a remote corner, it's been affected by everything. Um, so yeah.
I do like the phrase metaphysical kingdom, because in a moment we're going to start looking at your collages. They of course are, I think, because you've written somewhere yourself, you know, the kind of an autobiographical
Hmm,
narration really, and they are like kingdoms.
hmm.
Uh,
Well, you see, just to connect also to this place, I think that being on the Atlantic Ocean, it has a very special light. It's very rich light, and I think that the quality of beauty of this environment it affected me very much as a child. That was one of the first impressions I had of beauty, and I think that stayed with me, and that's partly why the creative, aesthetic, artistic spirit has been part of my own unfolding as a human being.
mm.
Yeah.
In that unfolding,
Mm.
did you have a sense that you would become something that was, you know, based in visual arts, for example?
Well, I did have a talent for drawing and so on, and initially it was looking like it would be my career
Mm.
actually as an artist, and I was actually going to go to the Royal Academy. But then I read a book by Krishnamurti when I was 15 or so, and then I went actually to ended up going to the Krishnamurti School in England at Brockwood, and that sort of changed a bit my direction. I then went into more academic uh, type of humanistic type of studies. So I never pursued it really. But you see, my feeling is that once you have a little sparkle of creativity, whichever field it is, it never leaves you. It's something that is really with you. So that's remained with me in spite of the fact that I never cultivated it. And it came out in this other way. Instead of doing drawings, which I used to do, very careful drawings, I was part of, I was taught partly by people who had been studied with Antonio Lopez Garcia, who is the top Spanish modern realist. And so I was very much of a Spanish modern realist. But that is a very painstaking type of activity. You have to spend hours and days and months just looking at something and carefully capturing the texture, the light, the feeling of it, and your relationship with it. is a meditative kind of process. I
Mm.
didn't have that kind of time, so somehow the collage was a much quicker way of composing an image from images that were already made. And that's why it channeled itself this way. As I say, the little flame couldn't be put out, and it had to burn in some other way.
What was the thing that made you come to collage, though? I mean, you describe it very beautifully in your writings. You say that, you know, you just sort of happened to be there
Yeah.
with sharp scissors, really, and started cutting. But what what preceded that moment of actually starting to construct and to make?
Well, that's a good question. I have to look back at that instant. It was really just a very lazy Sunday afternoon. So there wasn't, it was a very aimless moment, as a matter of fact. There was no real premeditation. Uh, but I had sort of leisure on my hands. And I remembered that some friends of mine had sent me some postcards in the past that they themselves had made by sticking things together. And I said, all right, I'm going to make a postcard. That was it, really. It was a very simple idea of making a postcard for my friends. But very quickly, I realized there was much more behind it. Uh, the first collage I made was a self-portrait.
Yeah.
And just with three elements, I realized I was reflecting my soul at the time anyway, very directly. And I said, how did that happen? By picking up three images from the magazines and the newspapers that lay around in the house, cutting the image out and sticking them together, I got a self-portrait. And I said,
That wasn't the intention, though, was it? That just
oh,
was
there
the
was no intention. There was not the intention. But you see, this is the thing. When you do something aesthetic, what's the intention, right? How does, for example, in my drawings, I always, when I drew something, I was attracted by the beauty of the thing, by the contrast of light, by the object, because of the realism, of course, from which I was coming, the background, the very object, the aesthetics spoke to me as a beautiful thing that had an order, a presence in itself of light and shadow, of form. And that was then trying to capture that feeling that that thing awoke in me was the art, was the intention, the encounter with that beauty itself. And if one is able to at all reflect it uh, in one's work. In this instance, the collage was more complex because you see, it wasn't me with an object. It was me, whatever that is, right? With a dialogue with the images that society itself keeps streaming in the popular magazines. So what? There's a connection also because those images are supposedly conveying some kind of meaning, right? They're saying, okay, there is the beautiful woman, and you must desire this thing, and she's next to a car, therefore you get the car. And so the desire transfers one thing to another. We're manipulating a commercial manipulation, there's a lot of it in there, but the aesthetics is also there in spite of the manipulation. So I realized that there was a possible dialogue also between what society, or the so-called society, the stream of commercialism and the information, the image making, it's a whole image making process. And they're trying to convey certain meanings, but the meanings they were trying to convey were not my meanings.
No.
Oh,
You wrote, I put it here because I thought it was a nice phrase. You said something about the indiscreet charm of the bourgeoisie is narrow.
yes, it is, because it sort of cultivates very low levels of instinctual drives, right? It's leaning constantly on the most fundamental basic instincts in order to maintain the consumerist uh, drive of society, economic motor of society. It's just appealing to that animal background. So it's a pretty narrow domain.
So,
But
without being too simplistic, then you were you were attempting to widen that scope.
yes, yes, that the meaning of a human body cannot be reduced to just a commercial object, And every object, see, I had this experience, for example, just watching television, that if you don't, if you listen or watch a bit widely, what you see and what they're showing is a completely different meaning from what they're saying it means. For example, I watched the programs of what they were, National Geographic or something, showing these wonderful fighter planes and these wonderful airplane carriers and destroyers, the machinery, the extraordinary technology. But nobody said these are killing machines. These are great constructs of the highest technology and knowledge to kill each other, which means that the violence is behind it. And therefore, all this technology really has no meaning. So you, in the sense of the meaning of it is, the purpose of it is to kill, whereas what they were all praising and enjoying and delighting in was this sheer accomplishment of the technology itself, right? So that's what struck me, that we can go on praising our achievements and not realizing what their purpose really is. And their purpose is really not an achievement, because we are destructive, not constructive. You see, that's the kind of dialogue I'm saying. Sort of that if I usually in my collages, or lately anyway, there would be some kind of airplane, some kind of fighter jet, at the same time that there is a bird or something like that, right? That the bird naturally flies and has his life and so on, but the fighter jet, it flies as well, but it has a completely different meaning.
I mean, we will. There's examples coming up in which we do see those elements. But I was interested when you sent me the images for me to use. I wondered about the kind of chronology of them. I mean, did you make lots of collages very rapidly in quick succession, or did you actually have quite lengthy gaps between the making of the collages? That part of the process I'm quite interested in.
Okay. Yes. Well, you see, I started as far back. I think the first collages I made in 2001, and but then I didn't do collages for another 8 years or so because of my mode of working. At the time, I depended entirely on whatever magazines came into the house. You see, into my home, and there were very few. My wife bought very few magazines, and so I had, you see, for making collages you need to have a wide range, at least the way I work, you see. I work with the images that I get. I don't buy magazines. I refuse to buy magazines myself. I said whatever comes in I use, you see. So I don't go out and just buy magazines for this purpose. So I was sort of reusing, right, recycling the images. But so therefore I couldn't accumulate enough images to make collages, the ones I did. But I did, during all those 8 years, I accumulated enough that by the end of 2009, I decided to make a whole set of collages to use as photos for these blank calendars that they make, right? You could put your own photos on the calendar to distribute as Christmas presents for family and friends. So that's when it really started. And then I discovered, because the kids, my two kids were old enough, and they started playing hockey. And at the hockey here in the Netherlands, where I live, in the hockey clubs for the kids, football clubs, hockey clubs, tennis clubs, they have an arrangement with the paper recycling companies, whereas they can set these huge containers, recycling containers in their clubs. They give the club some money for that, and therefore they support the sports of the youth, and they can have the containers there. And the parents, because they go to bring their kids and pick up their kids from the hockey games and so on, they drop their paper there. Well, that was a treasure, a
Yes.
treasure trove. I used to jump inside those containers. I used to get boxes of, and therefore there it began sort of the exponential capacity to produce many more. And so for a while I produced lots. Suddenly I began to, because I had all the images, I had all the wide variety and so on. And therefore I was able to develop my language also, my own visual language, my own, what I wanted to communicate. right? Because of that great variety of images I was able to extract from these containers.
What do you think the relationship is between your early training, that incredible attention that you had to pay to the realism
Mm.
of drawing exactly, finding that texture, finding the form so accurately? How has that then manifested, or has it manifested in some other way through collage?
I'm not sure, but I think what the main thing that occurs to me, I had not even asked that question myself. What the main thing that occurs to me is that I have still a concern for light,
Mm.
for the coherence of light and of the general mood. Now, in collage is more difficult to maintain because the images come from different sources, and
Mm.
therefore you try to put them in the same atmosphere and to have the light to be more or less coherent and so on. It's not always possible, and in the end maybe not desirable even, because you can create different moves by different lights and so on. Is variety. But I think there is one compositionally. I learned composition from drawing, right? To situate things, the proportionality of one aspect and another, the balance of form and light, and the coherence of light. So that I think that has continued. What collage has added, though, because I had not, drawing for me was black and white, but collage brought color.
Mm.
In fact, because I always did my work in black and white, I didn't have a feeling for color. And then when I started doing collage, it sort of exploded on me. So in fact, collage brought a new dimension to my aesthetic work.
All the titles that you've given me this evening for these collages
Mm,
are in themselves huge
mm,
things. You know, the language is loaded from the
mm,
start, and I can see the collage, I can read the title. Both things separately have a kind of authority,
mm,
and are highly interpretable, of course, and then together they create a kind of storm of possibility.
mm.
Do you want to tell us how you title? I mean, is titling something that happens after making, or is it something that emerges through making?
It's usually after. It's usually after.
I just
When I,
want to look at
mhm.
that. Does that mean that you revisit something that has already come into being and you try and
Yes,
make something fit?
quite. Often I discover what I've just made, or what I've just made means. There is, of course, an initial impulse from myself. But for example, in this one we're looking at,
Mm.
Dreams of Innocence, all I had was in the beginning was that background,
Yeah.
which is an empty room with the wall there, black background, but this red curtain there. Now, that suggested to me that there was darkness, there was light, and there was some kind of burning uh, quality, which suggests a passion or something. So I said, what can you make with an empty room like that? That's how more or less almost all my collages are made. Is a sort of, I find a kind of background. It's like a scenario. It's a sort of scene in
Mm.
which I set up then the elements which may contain a story, however vague or subtle it is. So in fact, that's why the titles is sort of a way of reading or suggesting a reading.
Is
And
that because you do genuinely want your viewer to find what you see?
but this is yeah, I do make them with a certain meaning, or a meaning that they have to me. I make a certain reading, but you know, it's also very curious because I discovered that when I showed it to people and I don't tell them what it means to me, they make their own reading,
Hmm.
and often it's just as good or better, and but it's theirs.
Yeah.
And that's something very nice. I find that then therefore the collages lend themselves to becoming a very personal experience. They don't have to be my meaning. And so even now, I sometimes I just hesitate to say what I meant because it is not necessarily what they will mean
Hmm.
for whoever looks at them.
That's why I'm curious still though about titling. Um,
Yeah.
You
Well,
wonder why you give them titles at all.
right. No, in a way, you could leave them and not say anything and let people make their own thing. The title does tend to give it a kind of implicit direction, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Like dreams of innocence. Now, innocence, dream. Well, dream because it's a dreamy scene. But innocence, where is it? The lamb? But that girl there is looking into the dark. Curiosity suggests a certain loss may be possible from experience. There is the cuckoo here, which suggests betrayal. And there is, of course, this balancing act between art and life,
Hmm.
between the Venus de Milo and the egg on a table, which is itself disguised as a zebra. So there's lots of ambiguities, there's a balance, there's a danger, and there's a purity at the same time. So that's a way, it's vague, but that's the suggestiveness and the dreamy suggestiveness for me. That was me though, but whoever looks at it will have a different thing. Then maybe they should ignore the title.
Is I have actually haven't included it in this presentation, but because you've been using magazines and taking images that I guess are from kind of like an existing cultural reference point anyway, do you hope that people notice the cultural references as individual segments because we understand these and read these quite easily as collages? So, for example, the Venus de Milo. Do you hope that people notice and realize that it is the Venus de Milo? Do you
Yes.
do you want later? I think you have Beth Ditto from Gossip. Like I said, I haven't put it in this presentation. Do you hope that people know and understand who she is and what band she's from? You know, are those in themselves signifiers? I mean,
Yeah.
are you deliberately leading us with symbols?
Yes. This is my intention. This is one of the things that, for me, because art is such an important part of my background, I
Mm,
bring it in a lot. But that is always symbolic, and I have a fairly large, broad cultural reference system,
yeah.
and I do put them in there with that intentionality that the viewer hopefully understands it. You see, I have discussions, for example, I showed my collages to my kids and they say, well, what is that? And what is that? So they don't know necessarily, you see. And when I tell them, they say, whoa, there is a lot of stuff going on there and that they don't even know. So it is indeed one of the aspects of generally of my collages. Not all of them have this reference, but because of my artistic background and cultural background, I studied humanities and all that. So I do bring it in, and I do mean it to be read as such.
So you do have some hope for the collage, that the collage is is made by you, constructed, though you say without intention,
Mm.
and then it is received by the viewer, and that you hope they do in fact see something that you control.
Yes and no, because of what I just said, that the viewer makes also the collage. The collage may trigger completely different associations. It's associative. It's
Yeah.
how, in many ways, right? I put things together. I put that Venus de Milo on one end of the table and an egg at the other end. Uh, what? Uh, I don't know what people would make of that. I just have my own little association, but that's not exclusive. And nonetheless, I do put a meaning and make it with that meaning. And hopefully people understand that much, but they don't have to. They just have to understand their own thing.
Do you think art is an elitist phenomenon?
Depends. But you see, art would be an interesting discussion. What is art, right? But I think we're losing culture. I think our education has become unbelievably superficial. It's kind of pragmatic, technical. I don't know. We're becoming cogs in a machine, and a machine that has no ultimate significance. So I am concerned with that. I'm concerned not to lose, if you like, the deeper reference concerning our overall human issues, both existential as well as transcendental aspects, and that we're responsible for what happens here altogether. I think our art at the moment is lost. What I find is that nobody wants to think very much. The art has become decorative. They just want a nice picture. This is what I mean. I may be wrong about, there are all kinds of art, so my exposure may be very limited, and I may be overextending my views. But this is the feeling I get when I have friends of mine who have galleries and so on, and I go and see what they are exhibiting in art. It's just a comfortable little picture that you can put on your sitting room and just live with it without disturbing your peace. I don't believe in that either. There is an important aspect, aesthetic aspect of order, beauty, and so on, pleasure even, in aesthetic pleasure. But at the same time, I think that we have issues, and art is a mirror. Art is holding, like good old Shakespeare, holding up a mirror up to nature, right? Human nature. And that is partly what I try to do. If that is elitist, then I am for it, because of the sense that we are becoming so hollow in our culture. The West is losing it, and the East also. Anyway, everybody. We're sort of, I'm concerned with that, deeply, deeply concerned. And therefore, maybe because of my background and all the classical references and so on, I really would like to maintain that overall dialogue. Culture is a dialogue that humanity has with itself, that consciousness has with itself, in its movement through time and its encounter with its own, with the potential timelessness of its own existence. It's a tremendous thing. And I think that in the overall daily exercise of social interaction and of communication and the media, that is completely lost sight of. We becoming myopic to the deeper questions and the deeper. So if for myself, it's important to remember that and to reflect that to whatever extent. So no, art is not elitist. Art means to point out to something that's deeper and subtler. That's why it can be called elitist, but in itself it's not. It's not meant that way. Elitism means to create yourself kind of an elevated position above the common run of mankind. That's not the point. On the contrary, is to remind us of what is more essential and deeper in common for all of us. But it's perhaps subtler than what the so-called popular movements tend to embrace. That's where it's sort of people tend to think is maybe elitist. No, it's subtler. It's meant to remind us of the deeper elements.
I do find myself though, and perhaps I too share a sense of almost like an urgency that we must pay attention somehow. But I do wonder a lot of art, whether it's made for other artists.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of art that I encounter is great for me because I have an art background, and that's part of my experience. And so I don't feel cut out or left by the side when I view art. I'm coming to the point though with the collages and looking at your work. I sort of feel like collage is one of those most extraordinary mediums where everybody is invited because the sources are from everywhere.
Yep.
And so even though there are very particular references in these images, there are also references that anybody can understand. We may not all have necessarily the same understanding, but that we also do actually all have the opportunity to meet the understanding on our own terms from our own experience. And there's an incredible richness. Looking at this, the Blue Victory, I'm back to titles again. And I mean, I think, to me, quite an obvious emblem, an emblematic sense of victory. I don't know, what were you playing with, actually? I'm just going to ask you, what were you playing with that title?
Well, blue means sad. So it's a sad victory. It's still, that basically is a victory of some Thrace in blue. The
Yeah.
Strahny sculpture in the Louvre, like
Yeah.
one of the greatest sculptures in all whole world.
Yeah.
And, but you see, what we have here is actually the landscape is a lava field on which all these things are there, and it's reaching out into the city, and it's already tumbling one tower. So there's a sense of, for me, this was partly to try to express my sense of doom, and yet the possibility of some salvation somewhere. But what is being happening of the destruction in the world with climatic change and all that is like there is this desertification coming, and there is this sense of we have triumphed with our technology and all that, but is a sad victory in that it is defeating itself by bringing this catastrophe about. That's part of the background feeling I had, and that's why it's a bit somber. The image is also itself a bit somber, and love is there in this sculpture, which is also a bit sad in itself. There is the jet fighter, the violent element. There is nature, of course, there, and it's the city.
Can I just ask something though about direction? I actually think you and I talked about this when we met each other. We had a conversation about how we perceive the past on the left and the future on the right. When you're making the collages, are you looking for things that lean into a direction which to guide us to ideas about how we travel through time?
Well, interesting. Yes, time has a lot to do with what I do, actually. Indeed, generally I bring it in, but I bring it in not as direction, but as the reflection of a constant in human experience. I generally don't. Sometimes I hint at some direction. Like for example, here, for me, the sense of hope is in the foreground. It's in the sense that I've known as a kid, for example, that wherever they threw the the the, the debris from the buildings, these kind of flowers, these kind of calla lilies grew. So out of the ruins, life can come. So that's part of it. And then, of course, you have these animals and so on, and you have all this rich sort of potential nourishment, even though these guys are there in these suits, which obviously, for me, signifies some kind of poisonous environment.
Yeah.
So some kind of regeneration may still be possible in spite of all this. That's what I'm trying to suggest there, at least for myself, that life can come out nonetheless out of our own ruin. Uh, but time is interesting because for me, time is kind of reflects constants, the past and the present and the future, as far as human beings and our ways seems to be stuck. I have that sense of the labyrinth of time, of the human consciousness being trapped in time, and what it thinks is moving forward is just a repetition of its own past. So I'm not sure that that is absolute in any way, but I do feel that strongly.
Do you think that collage specifically though does give a greater sense of a greater amount of time to its audience because of its nature?
Yeah. Well, that's a very subtle observation. Can, because you can bring it in much more directly. If you're doing a drawing, I'm not sure how you would put it in there, but here you can bring in time. That's one of the things I like very much about it, that I can bring the past and put it in there in the present and all that all together and bunch them together and have them speak to each other.
Yes, because I'm just not sure that with really many other forms one
Mhm.
can, so though the the meaning outcome may be very subtle. The fact is that in most other ways of making, no matter how long perhaps the craft of the thing may have taken, like a drawing that's taken many days or a painting that's taken many months, perhaps years, or indeed a photograph that takes a second or less. With collage, there's the capacity to collide many times.
Quite right.
You know, where we're not addressing the value of time so explicitly in these other forms.
I think that's a great observation. Yeah, quite right. Yeah. This is one of my favorite collages, actually, because I sort of was bringing together. See, it's very difficult to put very complex ideas together symbolically from just drawing on popular trash magazines, which is basically what people throw away. So it takes a while to gather all those elements. And I was very happy also with the consistency of the feeling and of the light and so on.
Yeah. I find it very interesting when you were talking about how you waited for 8 years to kind of accumulate magazines. I'm an avid consumer of magazines. And I have a huge problem when I've read a magazine, which is that I find enormous interest in the things that are contained within those otherwise disposable pages. And I don't mean the content of the writing or even the fact that I'm being sold something very overtly through advertising campaigns. I find it very difficult just to discard the magazine. It's caused huge problems when moving house because there are so many magazines that are accrued. And I'm going to say something that's shameful and that I'm just about to rectify very soon with a giant bonfire in my garden, unless anyone watching wants to come and purchase these things from me. But I have every single Vogue since 1998.
Whoa, but well, it's a pity you're so far away, because I would come to your garden and I would be delighted to have those treasures and cut out all those images. Well, you see, there you are. You have a treasure and you're going to burn it.
I think what's happened is that I realized the ridiculousness of it.
But some people might be interested in your collections, by the way, so you might think about putting the word out.
But even things like going to like a dentist or a doctor, and in the waiting, I always find it very interesting what magazines are left behind.
Well, that's one of the temptations I have all the time, of course, when I go to those places to look to those magazines, and I say, oh, I would like to take this image. I've on occasion taken some, but only the commercial, the ads. I didn't want to destroy the magazine, so I only took the ads. And when there was no article writing on the other side, so I sometimes took those.
Why did you say that this is one of your favorites?
Because it sort of conveys very strongly a certain feeling I had. You see, it's very difficult with the images have also a certain arbitrariness, right? Because it's somebody else putting an image for another purpose. And then you have tried to bring them all together for your own meaning. And sometimes the image just sort of deviate a lot from what you want. They just keep pulling in their own direction. And suddenly I felt that they all came together, and somehow the meaning was quite complete. There's always a fuzziness about it, of course, and I like that as well, that nothing is so definite. But at the same time, is complete, is sort of coherent enough, holds together. And when I look at it, I feel this is whole. This sort of is the way of art. The way of art is to put things in the right place, right? The harmony, the order, the composition, that things do fit. And I feel this fits for me, that's my criteria. Of course, I don't know. There's no absoluteness about it, but that's why it's one of my favorites. It has that sense of it. And the symbols are strong. Those two Spanish bulls could be pulling, in fact, a chariot on which the blue victory is standing. There's strong things in there, and all those images. And then the little joke. Sometimes I also put a little joke, like the little monkey stealing the car cab, the wheel cap, because he likes. That was in South Africa. The macaques
Yeah.
love the shininess, but that's us. So there's a bit of the little joke about us. We like shiny things, and that's why we have the cars and the wheel caps and run away with them. So I like this one, and for that reason. Mm,
I put two on a page together because
mm,
I noticed through my selection process after you sent me several to choose from that you do have recurring, if not motifs. Well, I suppose you do have recurring motifs.
Yep, I do, yeah.
The definitely mm, birds,
Mm,
the moon, uh,
mhm,
things that are circular or spherical,
mm,
depending how
mm,
you put them and how you've cut them and where you've positioned them. Um, I think for these two, though, particularly, I wanted to ask you about scale and
uh-huh,
understanding the language of something as rudimentary, really, to all artists, visual artists, as relative size. When you're
mm,
playing with scale so openly,
mm.
what's the purpose of that?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to understand your question. Scale, for example, in what sense? The size of the piece, the relative size of things inside?
Very simply, is stuff that's bigger meant to
Hmm.
be more obvious to us?
Hmm. Yeah, for example, in the first one of Providence,
Mm,
uh, I made these hands are very large in the foreground,
yeah.
and that moon, I think, is Europa, one of the moons of Saturn, in which they're looking for life in the moons of Saturn, as you know, and that is one of them. And then there is this huge ball and chain. So scale, the proportionality, of course, has a meaning as well, the largeness of it. And I tend to put cosmic objects also in my collages. I think that came initially because I felt strongly that human beings were too locked in our own world, and
Mm,
we lose perspective. We lost sight of the cosmic. Whereas this earth on which we are and which we becomes the theater of all our experience is just a small ball in space. Also, I often later on I started putting even the earth in the sky to
yeah.
signify also that the scenes that we're looking at are taking place in another planet, in the sense that it's just our own minds, and that we haven't yet even in some sense properly come down to earth. So there is also that play in my mind. But this providence, for example, has to do with life and its freedom, its joy, its substance, and the holding of the order of things. The way that moon of Saturn, Europa, has veins, is
Mm,
like veins.
yeah.
It's, if you ever had to look at a fertilized egg in the lab when doing biology, that's what it looks like when it starts hatching. So this is a hatching. It's a hatching. That's why you have an egg also down in the sand. The egg, the potential of life is in space as well as on Earth. It's everywhere. And there is the beauty and the attraction of the sexuality and all that. But at the same time, there is a sense of bondage that comes with it. And the tying of the knots of the two hands and the ball and chain that reaches right to the egg. So there's a sense of determinism, a sense of potential imprisonment, chains really of life and danger. That's why you have the light, the what do you call it, the
Lighthouse.
fire, and but at the same time there's sustenance. This guy comes from the sea with a big fish, if you like fish, and the birds fly in the sky freely, and the planets hold their order, and the boats sail at sea.
Mm,
Is that kind of playing with those things that providence provides, but also it brings his own warnings.
And is Salome a warning as well? I mean, it is a warning.
Sure.
But,
Well, yeah, Salome, this was one of my few attempts to make an illustration.
right.
Uh, the myth of Salome is, as you know, she danced for King Herod, and he was so delighted with her dancing that he's told her, "Ask me whatever you want, and her give it to you." And as a king, he couldn't go back on his word, and her mother told her, "Get John the Baptist's head on a platter." So she asked for it, and that's what she got. So is that sense of the dance of relationship in which extreme betrayal is possible. So there is a warning, a big warning.
Mm.
King Herod is the toad, by the way.
I was going to say the toad is Herod. But I wonder who the mother is, because I mean, I
Not
know
sure. I don't see the mother actually. I don't know the mother. It's very ambiguous because
I
uh,
wondered if the mother was were the two.
I think those were the girls, but the mother may have been actually the one dancing with this guy,
Mm,
because she was against John the Baptist, if I remember rightly, because John the Baptist opposed the marriage between her and Herod because she had been married to his brother or something. It was something
but also
objectionable.
there's something I might be wrong about this, but I'm sure there's another thing, a layer to the story where Salome had actually heard John the Baptist's voice and had been spellbound by it when he was incarcerated. And the mother got to hear about it and didn't like it.
Mm.
And so there was a double cruelty in
Uh,
asking the head,
uh,
which is why the double cruelty. I wondered if you'd perhaps put the two girls as some particular
mm.
symbol of real.
No, it was a bit just because they had these lion heads, these red lion fiery heads,
Mm,
suggesting some kind of youthful passion that would maybe be irresistible to a king. but not much else. I mean, it's ambiguous, the picture, and it has the moon in there hanging as a lamp, uh, sort of signifying also dream world. And there's a pigeon which looks a bit bedraggled. The
mm.
pigeon of is the spirit
You
when
said
you betray.
you said this is
Hmm?
an attempt to be illustrative. You know,
Well, but I sort of just played around with it because the background is just an ad for a Spanish manufacturer of bathroom fixtures, and it looked like a little palace. So I
mm.
said, "All right, that's a palace." So that's Herod's palace, and we get the
I, d-
story of.
I'm wondering about the word though. Illustration. Is all are any of the are all your collages illustrative? Are they all illustration, or are they something else?
Well, in they don't illustration. I just mean by telling a story that has already been told, and that they are not. But in another sense, to illustrate just means to show, to put out an image
Mm,
that represents something. So to that extent, all my collages are illustrations,
yeah,
in the sense of
but not
not what.
not prescriptive.
Not
Illustrate.
prescriptive. No, they're not prescriptive. I don't have an absolute meaning to convey or a dogmatic stance. Yeah.
When you were making the moon's portal, did you feel at home because there was very little color?
This was I did it out of a challenge. A friend of mine, uh, who's an artist, she said, you're making all these collages in color, but and you call them. I used to call them photographs of the impossible. He said, well, the best photographers choose to do the photographs in black and white. Why don't you try that? And also your training as an artist, because I used to do drawing, was also in black and white. Why don't you try it? I was very hesitant because I felt I would lose the contrast. Because if you go black and white, the contrast could be easily lost. But I tried it, and actually I was surprised by the effects. Yeah, it was there are problems with it sometimes because the contrast indeed disappears at certain points. But I was pleasantly surprised that they could be done.
And there we go with the moon again. I mean, both in the moon's portal and
Yeah.
premonition of war, the moon has
The
its
moon,
particular.
yeah, the moon stands for all kinds of things, right? It's is the planet of women, but it's also the planet of dreams.
Mhm.
Is that which moves the tides, moves our desires, moves the seasons, the generative, the sap in the trees, is an extraordinary force.
Mm.
So it has a lot to do with fertility, with all that.
Does the moon recur for you in other aspects? Do you write about the moon? That sounds like a silly thing to ask, but
Hmm.
moon is a very potent
Hmm.
symbol, as you're saying. It means lots of things.
Can mean lots of things, yes.
It's rooted
Yeah.
in an ancientness that um, has a wealth of context.
Mm.
Mm,
Mm.
does it feature large elsewhere in your life beyond the collages?
I always found it as an extraordinary reminder of the cosmic forces that actually have a lot to do with our lives. I had this curious experience as a child, in which I was just going out. We had a herd of sheep, and I was grazing them over the hills. And it got late. It got late in the evening before I was going to return with the sheep, with the herd back home. And the moon was rising, and the horizon was a full moon, and it was huge. I could not believe the size of this thing. But that came with a sense of enormous power from beyond. It was not the light, it was just the size, the presence, and magnetism that was there. It was very tangible. And it happens, I mean, every time the moon is full, something is happening in the world. Something is happening in the mood, in the mood of my mood, and in the world. And in fact, the blackbird sing a bit late. So there is something to that, of the reminder that these forces are there, and that we're not ourselves in that regard. We are moved also, right? So that is part of it. These cosmic objects have for me, and the moon is the closest.
When you described though being a boy and looking at the moon, were you looking at the moon with the catalogue of context you've just described, or had you actually disappeared and it was only the moon?
Yeah, I think that is correct. I mean, those associations come later. One makes up, one describes a certain feeling, attributes a certain meaning. But no, it was just the moon.
Mm.
It was just the moon. It was overwhelming. It was totally overwhelming sense of power.
And I mean, this is maybe a bridge too far, but then when one is in the act of making collages, in your case, um, though after you realize the mirror, you understand. In fact, you said you believe um, in the nature of reflection, and
Mm.
yet when you're making, are you are you actually are you present?
In some regards, yes, but because these are sort of snippets
Mm.
of meaning. Um, I used to describe this thing, and I think I sent you an article in which I described my sense of the composition being like the creation of a raindrop, the formation of a raindrop, in which apparently, according to what I read in elementary school, that was a long time ago. I'm not sure about the science. Um, there are just particles, dust particles floating in the air, and when the temperatures, and there's also a vapor, and
Yeah.
so when the temperatures low enough, the vapor condenses around the mote of dust. And then when the condenses enough, creates a drop and falls. So this is the feeling also for me, is that I have a certain feeling, a certain little mote of dust of meaning inside, and the images begin to condense around that feeling or around that intent, maybe vague enough, and then it precipitates the collage. The collage is like the raindrop that falls when the moisture in the air condenses around the mote of dust. That's
Fun
the
fact,
feeling.
though, I actually, exactly what you're talking about is something that I've underlined many times when I
Hmm,
printed out the article that you sent.
hmm,
And I mean, everything you're saying, of course, now is just is fresh, and you're saying it anew. But you did also say that you called it like the speck of autobiographical dust.
yes.
And then you went on to say, and that is another beautiful aspect of such works, meaning the collages. They're
Hmm,
mirrors of one's emotional states of mind, of one's experiences and reactions, of one's wondering about beauty, relationship, order, love, violence, desire,
hmm.
etc., which turns them into a form of self-reflection.
Yeah, yeah, yes, quite a lot of that. Um, in here, for example, in the Moon's portal, uh, not sure exactly, because this was I was trying to look at the universal sense of, you see, where we're at is a Harvard University library building. Nobody would know that. But I happen to pick up on that, and therefore it has to do with what does knowledge do in the world. And that was my thing, but what I was playing with, because I'm also a scholar, but at the same time you're aware of the disorder there is, and of the dreaming world which is behind it, and of the ancient world of the reptile that's still in the background of all our human actions, in spite of our best philosophy. So there was that sort of attempt, because look, one's mind works in such a way that one tries to understand one's own particular existence in the overall context of meaning of humanity of the whole, right? And these are a lot of little snippets, little attempts to bring those things together, right? So there is the desire and the mask and the moon representing that, the aspiration, right? And there is, of course, the statue, equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. See,
Yeah.
people don't necessarily know who this is. Marcus Aurelius, the good old Roman emperor and great Stoic philosopher, putting his hand out in sort of a gesture of peace. But under the horse, there is this skinny, starving little African boy,
Yeah.
right? And there's the emphasis, of course, with the zebra, just emphasizing that other world. And an ancient, it's an iguana, which signifies life coming from very far back, still running through underground. And there is this top model, evidently suffering from bulimia or something else. So this is what we're doing with beauty also, how we are in our world, we're starving ourselves for beauty where other people are really starving. So
Mm.
there's a problem there, right? And there is, of course, this chap with a hat, which of course reminds me of very much of Waiting for Godot, the existential aspect of that whole thing. And I stuck them together, trying to sort of say, what are we going through, right? This portal.
Though Premonitions of War doesn't have as many objects in it,
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
compositionally, I think, again, thinking about your chronology of making,
mm,
maybe there was a rhythm now to your composition. Each time you approached the kind of back canvas, so to speak, afresh. Did you were you conscious of that? It's something. It's quite obvious as I went through the collage. Is that there's a sense of real, actually, right up into the very last image that we're going to see, that you'd sort of found a stride of composition.
mm.
Um,
How do you mean? How do you mean? That's interesting.
well, I think one with these two particularly, I could say it's because of where the moon is located, but also the divisible space with, I guess, like pillar forms of verticals that are
Mm,
led upwards into the moon space on both.
Yes. Yeah. Quite. In this one of premonitions of war, what uh, what inspired me was just this photo of the background photo of this very strange cloud formation.
Mm.
Now, for me, it's a given fact that when something is about to happen, the nature reflects that there is a kind of, it's not just us, that there is a certain happening in life itself. And the clouds reflect it. You see it in the clouds, you see it in the light. I've experienced any number of those situations when major events were about to take place. So this suggested to me a troubled situation, something ominous, an ominous event about to happen. And I associated it with maybe this outbreak of war, outbreak of violence, which is always breaking out anyway. And I had these images which signified a kind of horror there and a kind of light that is unsettling, is disturbing in principle. The picture itself is not disturbing necessarily, but there is a disturbance in the light, there's a disturbance in the clouds, and there's a disturbance in human action.
Yet,
And there's
I
that.
did think very much with this one, with premonitions of war, the fact that the moon is inside the cloudscape.
Mm, mm,
Though to me, I mean, moon represents, as you've said, female, a kind of lunar goddess.
mm, mm,
There's an element of not benevolence, yet acceptance of like the circadian rhythm, and though
mm,
that's about time, there's also a sense of constance.
mm,
And
mm,
so, though this is premonitions of war, and there are things within it that may be frightening,
mm,
the moon's presence is like a balm,
mm, mm.
something very, it's very
Right.
reassuring. It's not relevant really what my interpretation is, just
Well,
more that it's I did find looking through the collages that there was a sense of
mm,
urgency to look at the world. And actually, you said that right at the start. You know, this um, worry you have, this fear that we're not really paying attention.
yeah, quite right. Yeah.
And so this is the last one we're going to look at, and I put it last because it's the one I find in many ways most curious. Um, because I didn't read it immediately as something that had the background stage.
No, it's in a much narrower space.
Hmm.
It's not, doesn't have the depth that the others have. This picture was from an interior decoration magazine, and it showed some kind of a bathroom. So it was not very deep, uh, and yet I found that maybe it could serve as the stage
Hmm.
for this accumulation of images. So that's how it happened. It was,
And are you using the same device here as you use with Samothrace, the blue Victory? Is that
not not exactly. I think it's this picture for me does not hold any sadness
okay?
or very little. Um,
I was surprised at the title because the last love
well,
of life.
this,
um,
yeah,
Is,
this
is
was
there
this was
any hint
personal.
of sadness though in the title?
Uh-huh. The last love of his life, because this chap was getting old, you see, and yet he was fascinated by this beautiful woman, but he knew it was just a dream, and yet he loved so much, so many things. You have a lot of art in there,
Yes,
almost a history of art.
yes.
So he's a lover of art, you see. So you have the horse, Phidias's horse, right, from the Parthenon, and you have that Madonna, which could be sort of easily medieval. You have that bust there, which could be neo classic, uh, and then you have Picasso back there on the wall. So you have a kind of art history, and then you have, of course, the blue lady, which is obviously classical, but painted in blue to make it more modern, right? That's the modernity in it.
Klein. I did wonder if
Yeah,
they
Klein. It is Klein, yeah.
were.
Klein, it's Klein. So, and there is, of course, desire and appetite in it, right? The top model there, Picasso, of course, is showing also his own desire. That's part of the series he did with about Marie Therese, which was extraordinary, just passion, really. A lot of when he saw himself as a minotaur and so on. The little can with the sweets there, just appetite, and then a piece of bread. And because of I'm coming from here from Galicia, and you have a lot of shellfish on the shore, and even the Saint Jacques, the Saint James thing. You see the big shell there. That's from there, and grapes and garlic, food, real food.
Is
Yeah.
that the moon tucked up away at the?
Yes, it is the moon. Yes, it is the moon.
I mean, I
Uh,
read this very much about bountiful beauty, women,
yeah,
women.
it is bountiful. It's an explosion in a way of beauty, which was essentially in the end, the poor guy had to give up his desire for the particular woman, but could not lose his love of beauty.
Mm.
And of course, he knew he was old and so on, and that death was somewhere in the picture as well because of the crow,
Yeah.
the raven. The raven is the classical undertaker.
What is the? Why do we return always to death and beauty?
Why the what?
Why do we
The-
always return, I think, as artists to death and beauty, or indeed beauty and death?
Interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, there may be a connection somewhere, though beauty itself, for me, has something of the eternal in it. You know?
Mm.
It was very interesting. Once there was a conversation between Krishnamurti and Bohm, David Bohm, and Bohm asked him, what remains after all this is gone? And Krishnamurti had to pause, right? Like, is this nothingness? Is this all gone, empty? And he said, beauty. Beauty remains. So beauty is one of the Platonic eternals, together with truth and goodness, right? Those three fabulous constants of the deep, right? Of the creation, of the creative source, right? But death is then to always putting a limitation to our own continuity, to our own endlessness. And yet beauty is that endlessness that we experience nonetheless as a mortal phenomenon. So that makes it all the more poignant that we have this contact with the timeless, and yet we know we have no time. Something like that. See, we have to accept that we have to surrender our own continuity to that which has a continuity or no continuity, has a permanence beyond us. We're just participating in it, hopefully as to a great extent, but it's not ours to keep.
Javier, I don't know how to really follow that most beautiful, eloquent finale, really. Thank you very much for spending the time talking to me about your collages and about other.
Not at all, Sandi. This is great and a great conversation. I think it helps me to bring out actually to understand my collages better, what we're doing in this exercise of artistic expression. Yeah. So thank you. I really appreciate that very much.
Well, I'm sure that we would talk again. I would very much like to.
Sure.
Very
Sure.
insightful. Thank you so much, Javier.
Not at all. Thanks. Thanks a lot to you. It was good to see you.